But I thought, well, we had such a really good discussion about the Sabbath school lesson on Exodus 21 and 22 that I thought maybe we would just continue to talk about that here. There's some really good stuff in this. Over the years, I've always appreciated reading the Mosaic Law because there's so many really good logical points in that on how to set up a human government. It demonstrates to me God's concern for our well-being, and it's kind of a practical religion all rolled into one. I figure if you're going to be talking and studying, one of the most important things that you can do is talk and study about things that apply in your everyday life. How can you be a better follower of the Lord and be more effective and better witness for Him? Mike?
I found it to be fascinating that the study the study reflected that the character of the leader is reflected in the laws of the nation. And if you look at different nations in different times and their laws, you could see the character of the leader and also the situation, the condition of the people, probably.
Yeah, definitely. So, before we get started on our discussion, let us open with a word of prayer, shall we? Father in heaven, thank you so much for this beautiful Sabbath day, this time where we can come apart from our normal activities, where we can rest and we can fellowship and we can praise you and study and worship you and learn more fully how you would like us to live and how we can better witness for you. Thank you so much for this blessed time and for these opportunities, Lord. Bless us now with your Spirit. Guide us and teach us. Give us the words that you would have us to hear and write them on our hearts, Lord, that we may live them out. In Jesus' name, amen. As I was reading through this afternoon again, I thought, what we were talking about in the Sabbath school lesson, Exodus chapters 21 and 22. This is the laws given at Sinai, in addition to the Ten Commandments. Now, you remember when Jesus was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, you have heard it said, whatever, don't murder, or don't commit adultery. And then he goes on to say, but I tell you, and then he went on to explain this in greater detail. And personally, I think these laws that Moses recorded, that God gave to him privately, were basically extensions of what God had given the people publicly in the Ten Commandments. Because remember, the Ten Commandments are about the relationship between us and God and the relationships between us and other people. And God gave Moses these instructions in more detail regarding human interactions, how we should operate our society, how we should relate to each other, how we should treat each other. And I've always seen in these great care that God extended toward us. He wanted these laws to protect the weak, to protect the vulnerable, to make sure that people were being treated with respect and being treated fairly. Which just tells me he's really concerned on the little things in our lives. I've heard people say, well, I don't feel comfortable asking God for help in whatever little things I'm dealing with, because he's busy up there keeping planets spinning and suns burning and dealing with nations and all these things, and he doesn't have time for these little things like me. But when I look at these laws, I'm going, yes, God is very much interested, and he wants to be involved in your life, in the details, little things. So let's look over here. Starting with Exodus chapter 21. Now, we were talking in Sabbath school today, spent a lot of the time talking about slaves and slavery. And the word that the King James used oftentimes is servant. The Sabbath school quarterly used the word slave. And we got kind of sidetracked on some semantics. Now, to us, when I say the word servant, what do you think of? Anybody? Works for you, okay. A waiter, okay. Now, this is when we say the word servant, what does that make you think of? Not slave. We're not.
It implies to me freedom and respect, because you're choosing to be a servant to that person.
Very good. You're choosing. You have a choice
Whereas
in this.
a slave is under duress.
Right. No choice.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I think of too. You know, when I hear the word servant, I'm thinking of a guy in black tails and a bow tie who goes, "Yes, sir, your morning tea is served, sir." You know, this is a very fine tradition. My family is a fourth generation waiting man. That sort of thing. But then when I say slave, what do you think of? You think of picking cotton. You think of being stuck on a plantation and somebody using a whip on you. Or you think of, how many of you have seen the Ten Commandments, the movie, where the Hebrew slaves are pulling the great big rocks and the guy's up on the rock with the whip going, ksh. Yeah. That's what we think of. Yeah, that's what we think of when we use the word slave. And the Sabbath school lesson used the word slave in all contexts, whereas the King James said servant, because these are talking about the laws. Well, actually, the heading here in chapter 21 in my King James Bible says the treatment of servants, not slaves. So let's see what it says here. In verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Now, what is this referring to as buying a servant? Mike?
It does have a parallel with Sabbath. Works 6 years and rest on the
Yes.
Sabbath.
That's a good point. Thank you for making that observation. There are certain patterns that recur over and over again in the Bible because God was trying to make a point here. The importance of the number 7. 6 years you serve, the 7th year you're free. But the context for this is if someone fell on hard times and they owed money or they couldn't make ends meet, they could sell themselves into indentured servitude to another member of the society, of the community, and that's how they could make money to take care of their family or take care of whatever their responsibilities were. And you worked off your debt this way. And at the end of 7 years, it was canceled. The person that you had sold yourself to doesn't say, okay, I paid $1,000 for you and you've worked 6 years, now you owe me $1,000 and you'll be free. The law here is, in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. You owe no money. Your debt is cleared. Now, today we don't think about that sort of thing because we have all kinds of government systems in place to take care of people in need. Everybody thinks the government will fix everything. Well, back then, there was no central government. It was all the people. So if there was a problem, the people had to work it out. Plumman?
That was the Hebrew after the Hebrew nation, after they were led out by God Himself, out of slavery, Moses gave those laws through God, and for them it was meant to be, they were forever to be theocracy. They were
Forever to be the what?
theocracy.
Oh, theocracy.
Theocracy, yes. So God was to be their ruler,
Yes. Yeah.
and the judges were supposed to know those laws, to enforce them, and to show other nations the fairness. Because the other nations, they had, like for example, I thought Hebrews, the Hebrew the people, they were slaves for 400 years.
Yeah, slaves in the context
Slaves,
we traditionally think of as slaves.
Yeah, so they were so much so in difficulty, like they were exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And God does not want anyone to be exploited. So
Exactly.
it was at the end of the seventh year, whoever was supposed to be taken care of through that arrangement, they had to be set for free. But there was a provision if the servant who was serving that master, there was a provision there that if he had a family and he was happy with what the master was doing with him and he wanted to be with the master, there was a certain provision that they had to go to the judges, and then by their goodwill, they would stay forever there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if we read down after verse 2 and down, so they were supposed to be brought to the judges if they wanted to stay there. So that's a voluntary basis.
Yeah, which says there was a good relationship between the two people. This wasn't a case of, I own you and you got to do what I want and I can kill you if I feel like it, and you got no protection and no recourse. Gary?
I would say the difference, like a servant, is there's an agreement between the two of them.
Yes.
Covenant, there's an agreement between them. But a slave, the owner, it's one-sided.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes,
it's
this
not a
was an
mutual
actual
agreement.
agreement between the two parties. I found this in, I'm so glad I got a set of these, Adventist Bible commentaries. If you have room in your house, get one. I know everybody's got it on their phone nowadays, but I like real books. Batteries can't die in real books. On page 611, if anybody's taken notes, for the notes on Exodus chapter 21. The judgments, that is, the ordinances by which justice or judgment was to be administered. Though many of these Mosaic laws were undoubtedly old ones that had been in force for some time, all were now to be enforced with divine approval. So some of these rules that God gave them, people already kind of had an idea about them, but God's going, I'm going to make this formal, and I'm supporting this. Some provisions may have come from judicial decisions rendered by Moses in the wilderness. See chapter 18, verse 16. All of these civil laws breathed the spirit of the moral law. They reflected and applied the principles of the Ten Commandments. So this was kind of a looking at the Ten Commandments, reading the fine print, so to speak. These civil ordinances were based upon and dealt with social customs of the day. Now, sometimes we get caught up and look at these things based on our own modern interpretation, but this is the context of this was back then. And this is an important concept we need to understand. God deals with people where they are and will bring them forward through growth and development. He doesn't expect you to just overnight become super Christian. In some points, the ordinances simply reaffirm legal practices already in effect. Some of them are similar to the laws of the Code of Hammurabi. it may seem out of keeping with our concept of the character of God that he should at least tacitly approve of such things as servitude, which we were interpreting as slavery, concubinage, and seemingly harsh forms of punishment. Some of these, if you committed some of these acts, the punishment was death. There was capital crime. It should be remembered that in bringing the Hebrew people forth from the land of Egypt, God took them as they were, with the purpose of gradually making them over into what he wanted them to be, fit representatives of himself. Though the new birth imparts to a man new ideals and divine power for attaining them, it does not bring instantaneous understanding of the fullness of God's ideal for man. The understanding of and the attaining to that ideal are the work of a lifetime. God does not work a miracle to accomplish this in a moment of time, particularly when the habits in question are matters of general custom and practice. Now, there was a law in here about how to treat your second wife or your third wife. And I was reading this to Munya this afternoon, and I'm just going, this seems just ludicrous. Just have one wife. Make it a whole lot simpler. But back then, this was very common. Even though that was not God's original plan, he made rules to see to it that later wives were treated well. Were he to do so, there could be no character development that if God did this instantaneously. For this reason, God takes people as he finds them, and through the increasingly clear revelation of his will, leads them ever onward to loftier ideals. Thus, with some of the civil laws given at Sinai, God for the time being permitted certain customs to continue, but erected a safeguard against their abuse. Final abandonment of the custom themselves came later. This principle of an increasingly clear and more complete revelation of God's will was enunciated by Christ in numerous places, Matthew 19, John 15 and 16, Acts 17, 1 Timothy 1. So, when we were all sidetracked about slavery or usury or some of these other topics, we have to keep in mind, God understood these people did not have full understanding. He's like, I want you to start here, and we're going to build on that. But I want you to begin with understanding that you all deserve fair treatment and to be treated with respect. And all of these laws basically express that. Mike?
I noticed too that the punishment fits the offense. You know, it's
Yeah.
cruel and unusual, at least what I know.
Well, honestly, we were talking about slavery and how it seemed like God was winking at slavery. But if we look down here, chapter 21, verse 16. He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Kidnapping and human trafficking were capital offenses. And as Mike said, let the punishment fit the crime. Well, why would that be a capital offense? What was that? Well, yes. You're just repeating what God said. But why would kidnapping and human trafficking, why would God say that's a capital offense? Anybody who's caught doing that was to die. Anybody want to venture a guess as to why God thought that was so serious? Mike?
Well, it could lead to death of people's life.
Well, that is true.
So it's almost like murder, maybe, in his eyes?
Well, there are, where he talks in here about murder, manslaughter, and differentiates between, first degree premeditated murder versus an accidental death or revenge killing.
Well, human trafficking, too, would not permit the worship of God, if you think about it.
Yes, now we're seeing a little deeper. Kidnapping and human trafficking takes away the power of choice from the victim. They no longer have any control over their lives. And the whole point of these was to give people control. I mean, you look over here.
Is that pertaining to women too?
Yes, but sadly not as much. This applied to I mean, as far as the punishment for human trafficking, yeah, that would apply to anybody. But look down here in verse 7. If a man sell his daughter to be a maid servant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. It's said over here, what verse 7? Among ancient nations, the authority of a father was generally so absolute that he could sell his own children as slaves. Herodotus tells us that the Thracians made a regular practice of selling their daughters. At one time, according to Plutarch, the sale of children was common in Athens. Female slaves were usually bought to serve as concubines or secondary wives of their masters. And then it goes on to make these rules for the women. Now, we've all heard of the bride price. I mean, even to this day, there's a little piece of that basically heathen custom. In Christian weddings, we go, who gives this woman to this man? Plumman?
Maybe we have to look at it as something in a bigger picture in terms of the great controversy.
Always a good idea.
Yeah, the great controversy is Satan actually stole the human race by deception. So all those who are stealing, in a way, talking about human trafficking, they're giving the victim something that is very much a promise for a better life or something like
Yes,
that.
definitely.
Yeah. So Satan said, you will not die, but you will be like God.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, to know good and evil. And Adam and Eve fell for that. But actually, that was the deception, and they kind of... So in all the laws that God gave to Moses, we have to always think about the picture of the great controversy, and God wanted to protect people by giving the civil laws. So if you eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
Yeah, he's basically making the point that justice needs to be served.
Justice needs to be served,
The
and it will
punishment
be
needs to be
served,
commensurate.
even though Jesus expanded on it. Yeah.
Well, another point, when you're saying we need to look at this from the perspective of the great controversy. Us, the body of believers, the church, is known as the what of Christ? I thought I heard somebody say bride. The bride of Christ is the church. That's us. Jesus paid a price for us. So when here it's talking about there's a bride price, a man may sell his daughter to another man to be a husband, but if he misrepresents this, then she has to be redeemed. The transaction has to be reversed. The guy basically has to give a refund, and the father takes the daughter back and finds somebody more suitable. Jesus paid for us the ultimate price. Shall we?
I'd like you to explain verse 9, chapter 21, verse 9.
And if he has betrothed her, this is the man in the same context, the man who's bought another man's daughter to bring her into his family, either as bride of his own, or perhaps for one of his sons. And if he hath betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. So you bring this person into your family. She's left behind everything that she's familiar with. Because remember, family was the basis of the society. You were in a family. You were part of a group. These were the people that had your back. They supported you. You supported them. You took care of each other. This was the main unit of the whole society. And if you took a woman out of her family and put her in a different family, it would be as if one of us just got on an airplane one day and flew to another country and got off in another place and going, okay, I'm here. I don't know where anything is. I don't know anybody. I don't know the language. I don't know the customs. So you have to take good care of this person. So if you bring this woman into your family, you can't treat her as a second-class citizen. You can't treat her like, the red-haired stepchild. She is going to be treated as if she was your own daughter. And elsewhere, God made provision. He told about the kind of inheritance. Earlier on, when he talked about the inheritance of the land, he even made special provision that women were to get an inheritance as well, not just the men, which was revolutionary at the time because every other society in the world at that point was the guys get all the goodies and the girls get nothing. Much like, it's an Islamic society today. A husband has the right to beat his wife to death and everybody be like, hey, that's how it works. God was completely opposed to that kind of treatment. So he said, you bring this girl in, she's going to get treated like a daughter. You've got to treat her like family.
In the previous verse, they're talking about who has betrothed her to himself.
If she please not her
And
master.
so I'm wondering if it's the same in 9, or if he's taking the woman to him for himself, or all of a sudden he's decided he should give her to his son. I don't get it.
Well, that was a possibility. In verse 8, if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. She's going to be protected better. If she please not her new master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. In other words, because a lot of this stuff was arranged marriages. You didn't know who you were getting. The guys that get together and go, you got a son. He's about that age now. You need to get him married off, keep him out of trouble. I got a daughter. I got some extra daughters. I need some money. Let's work out a deal here. So they make this transaction, and the woman comes in, she gets out of the stagecoach, and everybody's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. They can't go, oh, well, you weren't what we were expecting, so too bad for you. They actually have to reverse the transaction, refund the money, let her go back to her family, as that's what the context here is. He shall let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing that he has dealt deceitfully with her. Because the agreement was, you bring her into your family, she's going to be part of your family. You're going to have to protect her and take care of her as if she was your own flesh and blood. And if you decide, oh, wait a minute, I've changed my mind, you weren't supposed to be able to do that. But if you did, you had to make it right. You couldn't sell her to somebody else. You couldn't go, oh, okay, she's second rate, just, whatever. Sell her to the Egyptians. That was not allowed. No Hebrew was allowed to be sold as a slave to anybody outside of Israel.
Well, how about in number 10? Do they just take another wife?
Well, no, that's for the case of the guy who gets more than one wife. If he takes another wife in addition to the first one, it's not if he changes his mind and switches, not like today with the serial monogamy. I love you until I don't anymore, and then I'm going to go get somebody else. That's not what this was about. This was a different problem. This was guys who collected women, for all intents and purposes.
That was allowed?
God did not approve of it, but it happened, so God made rules to say, well, if you're going to do this, I'm going to make sure that you're not abusing people while you're doing it. But originally, God's plan was, well, I mean, he didn't make Adam and Eve's. He made Adam and Eve, one and one.
Right, well, what happened to remembering that plan?
Look at human history. How many other things did God tell us to do that we didn't do properly either? But these were particularly important to God because they dealt with the relationships at the family level. So he's like, you got to have some guidelines here. I'm not going to let you mess this up the way you messed everything else up. I'm going to give you a little more instruction on this one. So originally, God's plan was not that you would have more than one wife. But it started early, and it hung on. And as we'd read earlier, God dealt with the existing structure of the culture at that time with the intention that practices he didn't like, eventually he was going to bring them out of that. And so the plan was, we're going to get rid of polygamy, and we're going to go back to the original plan. But until that time, when people keep doing this, I want some guidelines in there so that you cannot mistreat these women, which was revolutionary because all the other cultures at that point were like, women don't count for anything. God's making a point here of going, you have to treat the girls fairly. And a lot of people were like, wow, we never saw it from that perspective before.
Free.
Well, let's look back here in 9. If he takes another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage, he shall not diminish. Basically, he's saying any wives that come after the first wife have to be treated equally with the first one. And if he did not do that, as in verse 11, if he does not do these threes unto her, then she's free to go, and nobody has to buy her back. Nobody has to give this guy money to let her go. She's like, sorry, dude, you broke the contract, I'm out of here. And everybody be like, yep, she's free to do that. You mistreated her.
What does the going out free mean?
Well, originally, he would have had to pay money to get her. So he's going, well, I'm sorry, you're not meeting the criteria, so I want a refund. And they're like, oh no, buddy, you broke the contract. You don't get a refund. She's free to go. She can go back home again, and her dad doesn't have to return the bride price.
And what if it's a long way? Is he responsible for sending her back?
Well, that's what the judges were for. There's no specific rule for that sort of thing, but she would go to the judges and say, hey, you know what? It's a 4-day travel from where my family is to here, and this guy broke the contract. The law says I'm free to go, but I need help getting back home. He needs to pay for that too. And the guy will be like, I'm not doing that. And the judges are going to be like, yeah, I think you are. Because the underlying principle here is everybody is due proper respect and fair treatment.
Right. Right. Okay, thank you.
And Jesus said in Matthew 19:8, he was expanding on things like divorce and stuff, but Moses allowed this because of the hardness of your hearts.
Exactly.
But in the beginning, it was not so.
Exactly. There were lots of practices God did not approve of, but people were all doing them. And God said, well, I'm going to have to take them where they are. If I come down here and go, okay, everything you know, forget it. We're starting over from scratch. It would have been a complete disaster. I mean, look at how many times we make New Year's resolutions that barely make it to the end of the first week. If God came in and said, okay, all of the things, all the institutions in your society that really don't agree with what my plan was, I'm going to pull the carpet out from under you right now and we're going to get rid of everything, it would have been a complete failure. I mean, look at the progression of new light that God gave at the end of the Dark Ages, when he started to restore the people's understanding about the scripture and his law. Martin Luther was told, you are saved by grace, not works. Because that was the big thing. Everybody's like, as long as I do all the things the priest tells me to do, I'm in. God's like, no, that's the big one. We got to start with that one. And a lot of people go, well, Martin Luther was bad because he didn't know about Sabbath. Ellen White even said, if God had revealed the full extent of all of the things, how far off people were from what his ideal was, nobody would have been able to handle it. And they would have gotten discouraged and given up. So light is revealed progressively, a little bit at a time, and once that's understood, then you get a little bit more. So at this point in human history, people really didn't have a very good idea about worship of the one true God. I mean, the Israelites had been in abject slavery for a couple hundred years. I don't think it was fully 400 years. I think the beginning of it wasn't that bad, but towards the end, it was full-blown slavery. You had no rights, you were property, and you could be disposed of on a whim. And God's like, okay, you're coming from this, now I have to build it up gradually. First thing, you treat the women okay. You take care of the wives. Plumman?
Yeah, at the end, they were so treated badly because Pharaoh wanted every male child to be killed.
Yeah.
That's what, to the point they were. They were.
Yeah. Life was cheap at that point. God had to reestablish that each human life is valuable. Now remember, they had been slaves, and the slaves had no control, no say. Families would be broken up. Somebody could come in and go, well, I want to buy that one and that one and that one. And they're like, but that's my kid, or that's my wife, that's my child, whatever. I don't care. Those are the ones I want, I'm taking them. And we're the masters, we can do whatever we want. So God is reestablishing this, like, no, you do have rights. You have to be treated fairly. And probably the most obvious way to demonstrate that would be in family relationships. I mean, we've all heard the stories, slavery in the South, in American history, how families were broken up all the time. And the parents would be heartbroken that their child was like, but that's my baby. And, they take the kid from somewhere in Alabama and ship him to somewhere in Tennessee or South Carolina, far away, no contact. You'll never see or hear from that kid again. And God's like, no, this is not what I have in mind. And since there was no welfare system, they had to have a way for people to work off debt and take care of things when things went wrong. So he said, we can do this servant transaction. It's voluntary, and there are rules regarding how you have to treat the servants. And all of this was designed to teach them people are valuable. People have rights and are worthy of respect and fair treatment, which up to that point, it wasn't. Moses killed an Egyptian because that Egyptian was abusing a slave. I mean, think about that. Abusing a slave was perfectly normal back then. life was cheap. And Moses was basically in line to be the next Pharaoh. So he was the highest of the highest ruling class, which had power of life and death on a whim over anybody. So Moses could kill that Egyptian because Moses was royalty. Who's going to say anything about it? So even then, we have an example of life is cheap, and God's going, no, I want to change that. Plumman?
Even then, when Moses killed the Egyptian because he was abusing his brother, who was a Hebrew, and he had the idea of, he had the faith that God will lead him to do great things. But he took it upon himself. But when he was actually exposed to the truth, he had to flee because there were laws in this land. So he had to flee because if he did not flee, he was going to be dead, even though he was the next in line to be Pharaoh.
I don't know if his life was in danger exactly that way, because like I said, he was royalty. They had the power to do that. But I think the real thing was Moses was like, this is injustice. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to lead the revolution, and we're going to put it into this. And God's like, no, I'm going to use you to lead it, but you're not going to be the power behind it. So Moses goes off 40 years living in the wilderness. Now remember, this is the guy who was being trained to be the next Pharaoh. And what does he say when God comes to him and says, okay, now you're ready. Now I can send you to Pharaoh. And you're going to tell him, this is what I want. And Moses went, I'm not good at speeches. I can't do that. He went from somebody who was going to be the ruler of the most powerful nation in the world to, I can't public speak. God completely changed things. Moses finally got to, it's like, yeah, I can't lead the revolution. That's not me. And God said, now you get it. Now I can use you. Shelley? Here, Danny's bringing the mic.
With the gist of what's going on in here about how to treat one another, what did they do with deformed children, babies? Did they get to keep them?
Well, let's look over here. Verse 22. If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So basically, if you cause a woman to lose her baby, you're guilty. There's going to have to be some kind of reparation made. And it's up to the husband to decide what that reparation might be. Now, this is one of the texts that Christians use to say this is why we believe abortion is wrong, because God here is making rules for the protection of unborn babies. He's like, you can't do this. You can't just injure a woman and she loses the baby and go, oh, okay, it didn't count. It's not born yet. God's going, yeah, it does count. And by extension, I'm thinking, okay, if a baby's not born yet, you don't know how it's going to come out. God has already assigned value to that life before it was born. So I would say if a child was born and it had some problems, the value had been established before birth. So however that child came out, he's still valuable.
So what verse were you on?
22.
Chapter 22?
Chapter 21, verse 22.
Okay.
And down in verse 23, after that said, and if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. This is the same context of if a man injures a woman somehow, and I think the context here is like if a man strive and hurt a woman, it's basically saying if he's fighting with her. It's not an accidental occurrence. And if any mischief or harm, so if it sounds to me like if the death of the child or of the woman, either way, it's a life for a life. So in that regard, women were equal before the law, because earlier it said if a man fights with another man and kills him, it's a life for a life, and the same thing for a woman. So God is basically saying right here, the value of men and women is the same as far as I'm concerned, which was, again, revolutionary in ancient times, because it was always considered women were less valuable, less important than men.
So did he have anything to say about rape?
Yes. I don't remember where it is, but it is basically if a man forced himself on a woman, that man was also guilty of capital crime. He could be put to death as well. Plummet?
A little off the rail here in terms of Moses. After he killed, we read that in Exodus chapter 2, 11 through 15, but to save time, after he killed the Egyptian, verse 13, actually he hid the Egyptian in the sand. Then we read in Exodus 2:13, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well.
I stand corrected. You don't get any clearer than that. Pharaoh sought to slay Moses. It's like, I don't know that these two guys saw it, but it was known. It got
somehow
found
they
out.
had to know about it. Someone must have witnessed and said something.
Well, actually, if he killed the taskmaster, the slaves had to be there, because whoever the taskmaster was abusing would have seen it. So yeah, there were definitely some witnesses there, and apparently news traveled pretty fast. Plummet?
I believe Moses had the idea that God will use him to free the nation from slavery. So he took the task upon himself.
Yep.
But we know how that worked.
Yep.
And God had to teach him 40 years to become the meekest man on earth.
Exactly. So when we get the idea that, we're really talented and God's going to put us to use, and, I've got these great plans, God, here, let's talk about them. God's like, I'll get back to you. You got a little more work to do. So there's a whole lot more we could talk about here, and unfortunately, just like in Sabbath school, we just kind of barely scratched the surface on it, and we've gone through a whole hour already. But I'm not sure what's happening next Sabbath on Vespers. I think Gary is supposed to be back then, and he may be going back into the Revelation thing. But personally, I like this opportunity where we can expound on the discussion in Sabbath school, because everybody always says the discussion in Sabbath school class is never long enough. no matter how much we go over, it's never long enough. That's why sometimes I start on Friday and go backwards just to make sure. But, well, thank you for coming. I hope that you have learned some things here that you did not know before, and that you have a greater appreciation for God's concern for you. Each one of us is valuable in the eyes of God, so much so that if only one of us had ever sinned, Jesus was still willing to come down here and die to save just that one person. So we are of great value in God's eyes, and he wants us to treat each other the same way. So thank you for being here. Gary, would you close us in prayer, please?
Dear and gracious Father, we thank you to be here and study your word and discuss it. I pray that you'll help us to retain information and use it in our lives and be witnesses to you. I pray that you with us the rest of the evening and never forget us and pray for the day of Jesus comes. We ask you to pray in Jesus' name.
Amen. Well, happy Sabbath, everybody. Have a blessed week, and hopefully we will see everybody back here again next.